Story 1. I spent several years working in the forests of a country still scarred by its past. I won't name the place, but you've heard of it, where a genocide tore through the land not so long ago. The air there carried the weight of unspoken stories, even in the most pristine corners of the wilderness. My work took me deep into those woods, surveying land, documenting wildlife, marking trails for conservation projects. I'd often go weeks without seeing another soul, just the rustle of leaves and the quiet calls of birds keeping me company. The land, though beautiful, was haunted, not by apparitions or shadows, but by its history. Sometimes you'd stumble across remnants of lives long gone, a shoe half buried in mud, rusted tools, or fragments of cloth tangled in the underbrush. Most of the time I ignored them. It wasn't my job to dig into the past, but the skulls were different. I don't know how many I found over the years. 4? 5? Each discovery felt like a sharp intake of breath. The first time I froze, my heart hammering as I knelt beside the smooth, hollowed-out remnant of someone's head. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, deer maybe, but you know the difference when you see it. There's no mistaking the curvature, the unmistakable hollows of the eyes. By the time I found the third one, I'd learned not to react. I'd radio it in, make a note of the coordinates, and move on. That was the unspoken rule. Keep moving. But there was one day that broke me. One discovery that still keeps me awake at night. It was late autumn, the air sharp with the promise of an early winter. I was miles from the nearest village, following a faint trail through a section of forest I'd never mapped before. The trees were dense, their branches knitting together like a canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The ground was a spongy carpet of moss and decaying leaves. I was distracted, scanning my map and GPS to make sure I hadn't wandered off course, when my boot sank into something soft. At first I thought it was just a patch of moss, maybe a bit of mud. But when I stepped back, my stomach churned. Whatever it was had too much give. I looked down. It was a sweater, or at least that's what it looked like, matted, discolored, and half buried under the forest floor. The fabric was mottled green and brown, blending so perfectly with the surroundings that I almost missed it entirely. For a moment I froze. My mind tried to convince me it was just an old piece of trash, discarded decades ago and left to rot. But something about the way it lay, crumpled and sunken into the earth, made my skin crawl. I don't know why I did it, but I crouched down and poked it with the toe of my boot. The ground shifted. My breath hitched as I saw the fabric move. Not like cloth, but like something heavier, something with weight. I bent down, brushing away the damp leaves and moss, revealing more of the sweater. My fingers trembled as I pulled at the fabric. The sweater didn't come free. It was stuck, anchored to something beneath. And then I saw it. Bones. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. At first, it was just a single sliver of white poking through the fabric, small, almost delicate. But as I cleared away more of the debris, more appeared. Ribs. They were impossibly thin, like bird bones, but they were unmistakably human. They protruded from the sweater in uneven rows, their edges jagged from years of decay. I sat back on my heels, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The sweater wasn't just lying there. It was covering someone, or what was left of them. Most of the body was gone, claimed by time and the forest, but the way the bones were arranged, the way the sweater sagged over them, it was clear this person hadn't been buried. They'd been left here. I should have stopped. I should have marked the spot and left, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know. I dug deeper, pulling at the edges of the sweater. As I uncovered more, I realized there wasn't much else. The arms, the legs, they were gone, reduced to fragments scattered in the dirt. But the torso remained, collapsed in on itself like an empty shell. And then I found the skull. It wasn't whole. The jaw was missing, and the top had been cracked, as if something heavy had struck it long ago. But it was there, nestled in the moss like it had been waiting for me. I stared at it for what felt like hours, unable to look away. I didn't know who they were or how they'd ended up here. I didn't want to know. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a faint sour smell. I gagged, scrambling to my feet. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But as I turned to go, I felt it, an overwhelming sense that I was being watched. I scanned the forest, my eyes darting between the shadows. Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't fade. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of what I'd just uncovered. I ran. I don't remember much of the journey back, only that I didn't stop until I reached my camp. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely radio for help. When the team arrived the next day, I led them to the spot without saying a word. They found the remains, of course. But they didn't say much either, just took notes, snapped photos, and packed up what little was left. I never went back to that part of the forest. Story 2. I was in Colorado for a geology field camp, the kind of intense, hands-on experience they throw at you to separate the ones who love rocks from the ones who don't. This was the real deal. Dust in your eyes, sunburn on your neck, the whole 9 yards. One particular day, we were out on a sprawling mesa. The goal was straightforward: figure out the underlying geological structures in the area, folds, faults, and so on. It was all about interpretation, observation, and piecing together the story the Earth wanted to tell. I remember the sun was high and merciless that day, its heat bouncing off the rock like a physical force. The instructors had sent us off individually to explore. I'd wandered near the edge of the mesa, where the land broke sharply into sheer cliffs, and from that vantage point, you could see miles of untouched wilderness stretching out below. It was both beautiful and humbling. As I moved along the edge, my eyes caught something, a narrow crevasse in the rock face, almost like a vertical slit carved by time and wind. A peculiar shadow ran down its length, suggesting a ledge a few feet down. My curiosity piqued. That could be a cross-section, I muttered to myself. Cross-sections were gold. They told you everything about the rock layers, their stories laid bare like pages in a book. I decided to check it out. I eased my pack off and left it on the ground, figuring I'd only be a minute. Testing the stability of the rock with my boots, I began to chimney down, pressing my hands and feet against the walls of the crevasse. It was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but manageable. The air grew cooler the deeper I went, carrying a faint, earthy smell. Within moments, I reached the ledge. It was just wide enough to stand on if I kept my back to the wall. Perfect. I turned to face outward, eager to study the horizontal layers visible at eye level. My fingers traced the cool, sedimentary rock, noting the distinct bands of sandstone and shale. Then I looked down. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The ledge was coated in juniper needles, but beneath them were countless white fragments. I crouched, brushing the needles aside, and felt a chill crawl up my spine. Bones everywhere. Some were small, ribs, vertebrae, but others were massive. A bighorn sheep's skull stared back at me, its empty sockets accusing. Another glance revealed antlers and twisted leg bones. The fur came next. Matted clumps of tawny, gold-brown hair clung to the rocks, their edges fluttering in the faint breeze. The stench hit me then, thick, acrid, unmistakable. Cat urine. My stomach dropped. I froze, the realization dawning on me like ice water down my spine. I was standing in a predator's den. Not just any predator, a mountain lion's lair. Suddenly, the walls of the crevasse felt suffocating, the cool shade oppressive. My breath quickened, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my ears. Okay, I whispered, trying to steady myself. Don't panic. Just leave. Slowly. The juniper needles crunched underfoot as I straightened up, every sound amplified tenfold in the stillness. I glanced over my shoulder at the narrow opening above me, calculating the climb back to safety. It looked impossibly far, a sliver of bright sky mocking me. And then I heard it. A sound that turned my blood to ice, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't loud, more like a warning, subtle, deliberate, meant to paralyze. My brain screamed at me to look, but my instincts were louder. Don't turn around. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. Somewhere in the shadows of that crevasse, eyes were watching me, golden and unblinking. Time seemed to stretch, the silence between us heavy and electric. My legs felt like jelly, my hands clammy against the rock. Then, without thinking, I moved. I launched upward, grabbing at the walls of the crevasse, scrambling with a strength I didn't know I had. My boots slipped on the rock, and my knees slammed into the ledge. But I didn't care. Adrenaline surged through me like fire, propelling me higher and higher. Behind me, I heard movement, the scrape of claws on stone, the rustle of fur through the needles. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached for the edge of the crevasse, my fingers clawing at the dirt. I hauled myself over the top and rolled onto solid ground, the sun blinding me as I sprawled in the dust. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the blue sky, my chest heaving. The silence around me was deafening, save for the pounding of my own heart. When I finally sat up, I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it had followed me, didn't want to meet the gaze of whatever had claimed that ledge as home. I grabbed my pack and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground as I made my way back to the group. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not then anyway. I just said I'd seen some interesting rock formations near the edge and left it at that. But that night, as I lay in my tent, the smell of cat urine and the sight of those bones haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky. Lucky that whatever lived in that crevasse hadn't decided I was worth the effort. Story 3. I've spent much of my life in the outdoors, leading groups into the wilderness. It's the kind of work that keeps you grounded, teaches you patience, and reminds you of how small you are in the grand scheme of things. I've dealt with my share of challenges, weather turning on a dime, unexpected injuries, even the occasional bear encounter. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It was late summer, and I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids on a 3-day backpacking trip. My co-instructor Emma and I had planned the route meticulously. The climb to the top of Mount Sterling was tough, 6 miles of relentless uphill with heavy packs. But the view from the summit? Worth every step. The kids were tired but exhilarated when we reached the top that afternoon. We set up camp just off the trail near the fire tower. The sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the mountains, and the kids were buzzing with that unique blend of exhaustion and excitement. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, telling stories and laughing. The full moon rose, bathing everything in an eerie silver light. By 9:30, the kids were tucked into their tents, and Emma called it a night as well. I decided to sleep in my hammock, stretched between 2 sturdy pines. The night was too beautiful to waste inside a tent. I grabbed my book and read by headlamp for a while, letting the cool mountain air and the rhythmic chirping of crickets relax me. Around 10:30, I turned off my light and laid back, gazing up at the moonlit canopy. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving slowly up the trail we had hiked earlier. I froze, straining my eyes. Bears were common in this area, and I'd dealt with them before. But this wasn't a bear. It was a person. They weren't using a headlamp or flashlight, which struck me as odd. The trail was rough and steep. Navigating it in the dark without a light was almost impossible. Yet this figure moved steadily, almost methodically, up the path toward our camp. My heart started pounding. We were miles from the nearest road in the middle of nowhere. Who would be out here at this hour? The figure reached the summit and stopped. From my hammock, I had a clear view of the trail and the edge of our camp. The moonlight was bright enough to make out the general shape of the person. A man, I thought, though I couldn't be sure. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he carried no visible gear. I held my breath as he stood there, motionless, staring at our camp. The kids' tents were scattered around the clearing, with the campfire now reduced to glowing embers. Emma's tent was closest to mine, and her soft snores were the only sound aside from the occasional rustle of leaves. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching. Every instinct in me screamed to do something, to wake Emma, to yell, to shine my light on him. But something about the way he stood, so still and deliberate, made me hesitate. I felt like a deer caught in headlights, unable to decide whether to bolt or stay hidden. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man walked a few steps closer. My fingers tightened around the edge of my hammock as he stopped again, this time near a large tree at the edge of our camp. He sat down beneath it, his back against the trunk, facing us. He wasn't trying to sleep. He sat upright, his head slightly tilted as though studying us. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he lost? Was he dangerous? Why wasn't he saying anything? The hours crawled by. I kept my eyes locked on him, afraid to look away. Every so often, he shifted slightly, adjusting his position, but he never looked away from our camp. The moon cast long shadows across the clearing, and the wind rustled the trees, but otherwise the night was silent. At one point, I thought about waking Emma, but the thought of making noise, of drawing his attention, paralyzed me. Instead, I gripped my pocket knife, the only weapon I had, and waited. At around 3:30 in the morning, the man finally stood up. He stretched slowly, like someone waking from a nap, and then turned back toward the trail. He lingered for a moment, his head swiveling as he took one last look at our camp. Then, without a word, he started down the trail, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I woke Emma and told her what had happened. She was as unsettled as I was, and we decided to break camp early. The kids, blissfully unaware, groggily packed their gear, complaining about the early start. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched as we hiked down the mountain. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. We never saw the man again. Story 4. I work in environmental restoration, often surveying remote sites that seem forgotten by time. This particular site was deep in the woods, near the remnants of an ancient trail that hadn't been used in decades. It was one of those places where silence presses in, like a heavy blanket, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I had parked my truck at the trailhead that morning and hiked about 2 miles in, lugging my gear and a clipboard with site notes. The day had been uneventful, just me and the trees, until the late afternoon when the forest started to feel different. I can't explain it fully, but there was a change, a stillness that wasn't natural. I was crouched by a cluster of ferns, documenting the area, when I heard the first sound. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer or another animal. But no, these were deliberate, heavy, human. A chill ran down my spine. I froze, listening. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. The crunch of leaves and snap of twigs echoed loudly through the trees. The steps were coming closer, slow and unhurried, like they didn't care who heard them. I stood up, casually slinging my bag over my shoulder, trying to seem like I belonged there. I figured it was probably another hiker, maybe a hunter, though I hadn't seen another vehicle at the trailhead that morning. "Hello," I called out, my voice steady but louder than it needed to be. No response. Just the footsteps, closer now, deliberate and steady. I decided to start walking back to the main trail, keeping an even pace, not wanting to appear nervous. But inside, I was on high alert. My heart pounded and every hair on my body seemed to stand at attention. I could still hear the footsteps, now paralleling mine, somewhere just beyond the tree line to my right. I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead. Standing there, maybe 30 feet ahead, was a man, shirtless, his skin pale and slick with sweat, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. He held a crowbar in one hand, swinging it slowly in circles, like it was an extension of his arm. When he saw me, his eyes locked onto mine. Bloodshot and wild, they seemed to bore straight through me. "I've got a crowbar," he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally through the trees. I didn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. I wanted to believe he was just some crazy guy out on his own, harmless, but there was something about the way he stood there. Too calm, too still, except for the lazy circles of that crowbar. I managed to stammer, forcing a nervous smile. "Nice crowbar." His head tilted slightly like a dog hearing a strange sound. Then without warning, he screamed. A guttural, primal sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted, my boots pounding against the trail as I ran back the way I'd come. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, his footsteps faster now, erratic. The trail seemed endless. My bag thumped against my back with every step, and I didn't dare look over my shoulder. I didn't need to. I could hear him gaining on me, his shouts unintelligible but filled with rage. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The last stretch was a blur, my vision tunneled, my lungs burning. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it felt like an eternity before I managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed the lock down, and started the engine in one motion. As I peeled out of the dirt lot, I caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror. He had stopped at the edge of the trail, the crowbar hanging loosely at his side, his chest heaving. He didn't chase me onto the road, didn't try to block my way. He just stood there, watching as I sped away. It wasn't until I was miles down the highway, my hands still gripping the wheel so tightly they ached, that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I never reported it. What would I say? That some guy in the woods scared me half to death? No crime had been committed, not really. But from that day forward, I never went into the field unarmed. Story 5. I'd always loved hiking alone. Solitude in the wilderness had a way of quieting the noise in my head, and this trail, one of the more remote ones in the area, promised the kind of silence I craved. I'd been warned it was unpopular for a reason: steep, overgrown, and with more than a few stories about cougars in the area. But those stories were exactly that, stories. I wasn't a fool. I knew the signs and had seen them before. Scratches on trees, scat here and there. I'd always passed through without issue. That day started uneventfully. The trail was tough, but the air was crisp, and the forest seemed alive with the usual sounds. About halfway up, I noticed fresh scratches on a tree trunk. Deep ones. Too high for a bear, too deliberate for anything else. I stopped and snapped a picture with my phone. Cool, I muttered, shrugging it off as a sign that wildlife was thriving out here. A little further on, I spotted scat. Fresh. Steam rising fresh. Still, I wasn't worried. This was cougar territory, and they were known to avoid humans. By the time I reached the old shelter near the summit, the sun was dipping low. The shelter was as basic as I'd been told. 3 walls and a sloping roof made of weathered wood. It creaked in the wind like an old man's bones. As I set up my sleeping bag, the forest around me was a choir of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It started small, a shadow shifting in my periphery, the unmistakable snap of a twig underfoot. I tried to laugh at myself. City girl syndrome, I whispered, zipping up my bag. But the unease stuck to me like sap. My thoughts kept circling back to those scratches, that scat. I was 5 feet tall, barely 100 pounds soaking wet. Not exactly intimidating. Still, I wasn't about to give in to paranoia. I rummaged through my pack and pulled out the emergency foil tarp, arranging it around my sleeping bag so it would rustle loudly if something approached. Happy now? I asked myself. The words fell flat against the silence, and silence was all there was now. No wind, no rustling leaves. Even the birds had gone quiet. The night crawled. Every time I thought I might drift off, there was another sound, soft, deliberate, a rustle, a scrape. I lay still, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body straining to listen. At one point, I thought I heard something just outside the shelter, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. I held my breath, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. But nothing came. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was filtering through the trees. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had kept me awake. About a mile down the trail, I froze. More scratches, deep and fresh, gouged into a tree. Below it, another pile of scat. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a passing animal. It had been close, watching. I quickened my pace, scanning the dense brush on either side of the trail. That's when I saw it. A deer carcass, half hidden in the undergrowth. Its ribs jutted out like white knives. The meat picked clean in some places, but raw and bloody in others. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Cougars stash kills like this, I remembered, keeping them for later. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd wandered into something's territory, and it had let me know. My 3-day trip was over. I turned back, practically jogging down the trail, but the feeling of being watched was worse now, like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. I couldn't shake the image of eyes tracking me, hidden in the shadows. As the day wore on, the trail grew darker. The sun dipped behind the ridgeline, and the dense forest swallowed what little light remained. My headlamp felt like a weak defense against the growing gloom. Every sound was a threat. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, each one sent adrenaline coursing through me. Then just as I rounded a bend, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, unmistakable and close. Too close. I spun around, my headlamp sweeping the trees. Nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I tightened my grip on the knife in my pocket. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Go on, get out of here!" Silence, but it wasn't empty. It was charged, alive with something I couldn't see but could feel. My hands trembled as I backed away, step by careful step, never turning my back. The growl didn't come again, but the forest seemed to close in tighter with every step I took. When I finally burst out of the tree line and into the gravel lot where my car waited, I didn't stop. I threw my pack into the back seat, locked the doors, and peeled out, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Only when I was miles down the road did I realize I was shaking. Story 6. I've always considered myself a camping and fishing enthusiast. Living in northeast Oklahoma, I've spent countless nights out under the stars, listening to the soft ripple of the water and the occasional call of a whippoorwill. That's my peace, escaping the humdrum of life and letting nature wrap me up in her quiet. But this night, this one spring night, I wished I'd stayed home. It was around midnight when my two friends Mike and Josh and I decided to hit an old spot I knew. It wasn't exactly remote, just an old primitive camping area long forgotten by most. But it was quiet and tucked away, perfect for fishing and just hanging out. The road to the spot was nothing special, just a winding gravel path surrounded by tall oaks and the occasional rustle of undergrowth. As we approached the turnoff, we noticed headlights in the distance. A vehicle moving slow was turning out of the spot we were headed into. It was odd. I rarely saw anyone out here. The car passed us, an older sedan, its windows dark and faceless. Mike muttered, "Didn't think anyone else would be around here." Josh just shrugged, but something about it gave me pause. I brushed it off. After all, people could be out here for any reason, right? Maybe they were just camping or had finished fishing. We didn't think too much of it and drove on. When we reached the site, it was as I remembered it, quiet, untouched, and still. We parked, got our gear out, and set to unpacking. A couple of beers cracked open, conversations started flowing, and yet, something wasn't right. It was subtle at first. The way the air felt heavier, the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long, or maybe it was just the creeping chill that settled into my chest. No one said it at first, but I knew we all felt it. I caught Mike glancing over his shoulder more than once. Josh wasn't his usual loud, boisterous self either. Finally, I broke the silence. "Guys, I don't know. Something feels off. I think we should leave." Josh stopped mid-sip. "Seriously?" "Yeah, I can't explain it," I said, gripping the cold beer can. "I just have a bad feeling. You don't feel it?" Mike nodded slowly. Yeah, I do." Josh hesitated, but eventually agreed. "All right, let's pack it up. Not like we're catching anything anyway." We hurried to load the truck, and I swear every sound, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified. When we were finally ready to leave, Mike turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me as we rolled through the old campground, headlights cutting through the eerie stillness. Then we saw it. "Stop," Mike said, his voice tight. I followed his gaze and froze. Just off to the side, glowing faintly in the dark, were embers. Bright, unmistakable embers, like the remnants of a small fire. But no one had been here. We would have seen them, heard them. Mike killed the engine, grabbed his flashlight, and without thinking, stepped out. "I'll check it out." "Wait," I hissed, my pulse pounding. "Don't go alone." But he was already walking, the beam of his light bouncing ahead. Josh and I exchanged uneasy glances before climbing out to follow. The closer we got, the stronger the smell of burnt wood hit us. And then we saw them. 3 crosses, each about a foot tall, charred black, lying haphazardly in the dirt. The soil beneath them was freshly turned, the kind of soil you'd expect to see after digging or burying. "What the?" Josh's voice trailed off. Mike knelt, brushing dirt away from one of the crosses. "It's burnt," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a step back, my chest tightening. "Guys, let's go. Now." We all turned as one, hurrying back to the truck. The unease had shifted to full-blown panic. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Mike floored it, the tires spitting gravel as we sped out of there. The darkness seemed to press in around us as we approached the exit, our only focus on getting away. And then we saw it, the car, parked on the side of the road just before the main turnoff. "Isn't that?" Mike started, but he didn't need to finish. We all recognized it immediately. It was the same sedan that had passed us earlier, but now it was empty. No one in the driver's seat, no one visible at all. Josh leaned forward, peering out the window. "Where the hell are they?" Mike didn't answer. He didn't slow down either. As we passed the car, I turned to look out the back window. The trees beyond the road were thick and black, but for a split second, I swore I saw movement, a figure just barely visible in the shadows. "Go, go, go," I urged, my voice trembling. Mike didn't need to be told twice. The truck roared onto the main road, and we didn't stop until we were miles away back in town. No one spoke the whole ride back. When we finally got home, we sat in the driveway, the weight of what we'd seen hanging over us. Story 7. It was a bright, crisp weekday afternoon when I decided to take my dirt bike up an old mining road I'd heard about. This wasn't a casual ride. It climbed hard, gaining a couple thousand feet from the valley floor, deep into the Cascade Range. The sun was slanting through the trees, casting long shadows that shifted as I rode higher. I felt that sense of isolation I'd always loved, that razor-thin line between peace and unease. When the road finally gave out near the edge of a high basin, I killed the engine and let the silence wash over me. I strapped on my pack and started up the ridge on foot. The first stretch was dense forest, a mix of old-growth trees in areas where loggers had made their mark decades ago. As I climbed, the air grew cooler, and the forest began to thin. The towering evergreens were giving way to those scraggly, wind-battered trees that clung stubbornly near the tree line. About 20 minutes in, as I was navigating around a cluster of boulders, I heard it. Thump. At first, I thought it was my imagination or maybe a branch falling, but then it came again. Thump. Thump. I froze in my tracks, scanning the slope above me. The sound was coming from higher up, maybe a half-mile away, near the edge of the tree line. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and impossibly powerful. It sounded like someone or something was slamming a massive wooden post against a tree. The blows weren't random. There was a distinct pattern to them. 3 hard hits, a pause, then 5 rapid ones, followed by 2 slow, deliberate strikes. It was so deliberate that my first thought was that it must be a person, but the strength behind each hit, it didn't seem human. The wood resonated, a deep, ringing echo that carried down the slope like a warning. I crouched low, straining to hear more. The strikes came again, the rhythm shifting, almost like it was trying to form a kind of language. My heart was pounding harder with each hit, and my instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. Thump, 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 thump. A rapid-fire series of blows, impossibly fast like a drummer rolling on a snare. Except this wasn't a drumstick. It sounded like a tree trunk wielded with the precision of a twig. I whispered to myself, "What the hell is that?" Then it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I stayed crouched, my breath shallow, ears straining for the faintest sound. Nothing. No wind, no birds, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the eerie, oppressive silence of a forest holding its breath. I told myself it was probably some natural phenomenon, maybe a tree cracking in the wind or rocks shifting. But deep down, I didn't believe that. It was too precise, too deliberate. After a few more minutes of waiting, I stood slowly, every muscle in my body tense. I debated whether to keep climbing or turn back. My logical brain told me to leave, but something else, something I couldn't explain, urged me to see it through. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was stupidity. Either way, I started moving again, sticking to the shadows, my steps as quiet as I could make them. As I climbed higher, the forest opened up, the thick underbrush giving way to rocky outcroppings and patches of snow. I felt exposed now, like every step brought me closer to whatever was up there. Then I saw it. Just ahead, at the base of a tree near the edge of the tree line, there was movement. A dark shape, tall and broad, stood partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a bulk that seemed unnatural, even from this distance. It wasn't moving, just standing there, as if it knew I was watching. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. But I couldn't move. I was locked in place, my eyes fixed on the figure. Then it turned. I'll never forget the way it moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. I still couldn't make out any details, just the sheer size of it. But what terrified me the most was its posture. It wasn't hunched or animalistic. It stood upright, its head tilted slightly as if it were listening. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to just me and that thing. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned and ran, stumbling down the slope, my pack slamming against my back with each frantic step. I don't remember much of the descent, just the overwhelming need to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd just seen. When I finally reached my bike, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the engine started. The sound of the motor roaring to life was the only thing that broke the spell of silence that had followed me all the way down. I tore down that old mining road faster than I should have, the tires skidding on loose gravel. As I leaned into each turn, I didn't look back. Story 8. It was the summer of 2004. I was stationed with a crew out in the Hells Canyon area of Idaho. Remote country, rugged and eerie even in broad daylight. We were tackling an emerging wildfire incident, the kind of job that kept you working through the day and into the dead of night. I was the assistant superintendent back then, so I spent a lot of my time ahead of the crew, scouting the terrain, looking for hazards, figuring out our next moves. That night, I was on an ATV, heading down an old logging road that hadn't seen use in years. It was overgrown, with branches clawing at me as I passed, the engine the only sound breaking the suffocating silence of the forest. The air felt heavy, and the way the moonlight filtered through the trees didn't help. It cast shadows that seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. Then I saw it, a bobcat, or maybe a lynx. It was hard to tell in the dim light. It was sitting smack in the middle of the road. I slowed to a stop, waiting for it to bolt like they usually do, but it didn't. It just sat there, staring at me, its eyes catching the light and glowing like embers. For a good 10 seconds, neither of us moved. Then out of nowhere, it let out a scream, this god-awful, guttural noise that made my hair stand on end. Before I could react, it turned and scrambled up a tree just a few feet away. I remember shaking my head, trying to laugh it off. Weird, I muttered, but I wasn't about to sit there and dwell on it. I gunned the ATV and kept moving down the road. Not even half a mile later, I stumbled across something that stopped me cold, a cabin. It was small, maybe 1 or 2 rooms, and looked like it had been there for decades. Now, this was federal land, so there shouldn't have been any private structures out here. Curiosity got the better of me, so I killed the engine and approached it on foot. The place was a mess. All the windows were boarded up tightly, not the slapdash job you'd see from squatters, but deliberate, like someone really wanted to keep something out, or in. The door was even more bizarre. The knob had been punched out, replaced by a heavy chain that was looped through a hole drilled into the frame and secured with a padlock. It didn't make any sense. I mean, what were they so afraid of? I leaned in to peer through the hole where the knob used to be. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside, revealing a scene that was even stranger. Furniture was overturned, papers and clothes were scattered everywhere. It looked like whoever had been there left in a hell of a hurry. There was no sign of life, just chaos frozen in time. That's when I felt it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, that primal instinct kicking in. I backed away from the cabin, suddenly very aware of how isolated I was. I climbed back on the ATV and started up the road, trying to shake the unease that had crept over me. As I rounded the bend where I'd seen the bobcat, I hit the brakes so hard the ATV skidded. Standing right there in the middle of the road was a woman. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered nightgown that hung off her like it had been through hell. Her hair was tangled and her skin was pale in the moonlight. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice cracking a little. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. She just stood there, and the longer I looked, the more wrong she seemed. Her eyes, they weren't right. They reflected the light the same way the bobcats had. Then she screamed. It wasn't human. It was the same bone-chilling scream the bobcat had let out earlier. I felt my chest tighten, my hands gripping the handlebars so tight my knuckles turned white. And before I could do anything, she turned and scrambled up the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier. I swear to God, she moved like an animal, her limbs twisting and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. In seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the branches in the darkness above. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I hit the throttle and tore out of there, the ATV bouncing wildly over the uneven road. I didn't stop until I reached the crew, and even then, I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd seen. What could I say? That a woman turned into some kind of animal and climbed a tree faster than any human should? They'd have written me off as sleep-deprived or worse. I've been out in the wilderness more times than I can count. I've seen things I can't explain, but nothing like that night. But I do know one thing. I'll never set foot on that road again. Story 9. I had always heard stories about how unforgiving the wilderness of central Manitoba could be, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced that summer. I was working as a prospector's assistant, helping to survey magnetic anomalies across a sprawling stretch of untouched forest. The job wasn't glamorous, but the solitude, the raw beauty of the land, and the thrill of discovery made every moment worth it. It was late August, the final day of our campaign. The high-priority targets had been checked off, and we were tackling a low-priority site close to an old logging road. No helicopters today, just a quiet hike through dense brush, hauling our tools and gear. I remember thinking it would be an easy day, a soft end to a hard summer. I was wrong. Dave, the prospector I worked with, was an old hand at this. He'd been prospecting since the 80s and had a million stories, most of them hilarious, a few sobering. That morning, he seemed relaxed as we tramped through the trees, cracking jokes about his days blasting rock and drinking beers in the bush. I didn't think much of it when, around mid-morning, we heard yelling in the distance. "Anyone else supposed to be out here?" I asked, stopping to listen. Dave shook his head. "Not likely. Closest town's a good 50 kilometers. We called out, but there was no reply, just the ever-present hum of mosquitoes and the rustling of leaves. Shrugging it off, we pressed on. By 11, we heard it again, closer this time. A single voice, faint but unmistakably human. My skin prickled. Dave called out louder this time, but again, silence followed. He shot me a look that said, "Don't ask." Around noon, we reached an old blast hole from the 80s. It was a shallow depression lined with loose rock and overgrown moss. Dave said it had been used for testing during some forgotten exploration project. We set up to take samples, our GPS resting on a rock for a precise reading. That's when I heard it. A howl, long, low, and unearthly. It froze me where I stood. My ears strained to place it, to rationalize it. Wolves, I told myself. It had to be wolves. Dave went pale. "Don't move," he said softly. His voice was steady, but his face betrayed him. I reached for my bear spray and clipped it to my belt. That's when we heard the second howl, this one closer, too close. My stomach dropped as more voices joined the first. They came from all sides, one after another, a symphony of primal menace that sent a cold sweat down my back. Dave whispered, "They're circling us." I couldn't speak. My eyes darted from tree to tree, but I saw nothing, just endless shadows between the trunks. The howling stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving an awful, oppressive silence in its wake. "We need to leave," Dave said, his voice barely audible. "But you cannot run. If you run, you die." I nodded, gripping the steel sledgehammer we used to break rock samples. Its weight was reassuring, but it felt pitifully inadequate against whatever was out there. We left our gear where it lay, moving slowly, deliberately toward the direction we'd come. Every step felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the sound of our boots crunching on the forest floor. I wanted to ask Dave what we were dealing with, but the look in his eyes kept me silent. He wasn't afraid. He was terrified. Halfway back to the road, we heard a branch snap behind us. I whipped around, raising the hammer instinctively, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. Dave didn't stop, didn't even look back. "Keep walking," he said. We hadn't gone another 10 paces when it happened again, this time off to our right, then to the left. I tightened my grip on the hammer, my knuckles white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Dave never broke stride. "They're testing us," he muttered. "Don't look. Don't react." I forced myself to focus on the path ahead, but my peripheral vision caught movement, something large and low, darting between the trees. My pulse spiked. I wanted to run so badly it hurt, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't. I couldn't. The snapping and rustling grew louder, closer, until it felt like the forest itself was alive and closing in. I could hear them now, heavy breathing, the crackle of twigs underfoot. Still, I saw nothing clearly, just glimpses of fur, flashes of yellow eyes. Then came the growl. It was deep, guttural, and so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. My legs locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Dave grabbed my arm hard. "Walk! Now!" We moved faster, still not running, but no longer pretending to be calm. My eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if they were really there, but the feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. Finally, the logging road came into view, a thin, pale line cutting through the dense green. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. As we stepped onto the road, a massive shape emerged from the trees behind us. It was a wolf, but unlike any I'd ever seen. It was huge, its coat black as midnight, its eyes glowing with a predatory intelligence. It didn't growl, didn't charge. It just stood there, watching. Dave raised his hammer slowly, his other hand on his bear spray. "Keep walking," he said. I took one shaky step, then another. The wolf didn't follow. It just stayed there, its eyes boring into us until we were out of sight. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. Dave didn't say a word as he threw it into gear and tore down the road, faster than he'd ever driven. Only when we were miles away did he speak. "That wasn't normal," he said, his voice low. "Wolves don't do that." I didn't respond. What could I say? I stared out the window. The image of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that part of the world again. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Story 10. The wilderness has always been my sanctuary. I've spent countless nights alone in remote areas, surrounded by nothing but the vast expanse of nature and the humbling silence of the wild. But the experience I had a few weeks ago at a secluded lake in northern Arizona still haunts me. Every time I recall it, my skin crawls and my heart races as if I'm back there, frozen in terror. The lake sits deep in the forest, far removed from the beaten path. My favorite camping spot is perched on a finger bluff that juts out over the water, with cliffs plunging steeply on either side. It's an isolated haven rich in wildlife: elk, deer, bears, and even the occasional mountain lion. I've camped there several times, and while it's always been peaceful, there's something about that place that has never quite felt right. On previous trips, I'd returned from hikes to find a strange smell lingering in the camp. A pungent stench that reminded me of sweaty horse tack, mixed with a faint skunkiness. The smell would always vanish within minutes, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. I chalked it up to some animal passing through, but now I'm not so sure. A few weeks ago, my friend Dan and I decided to camp there. It was a spur-of-the-moment trip, and our goal was simple: unwind, enjoy the wilderness, and spread some of my dog's ashes at the lake, a place she'd loved as much as I did. We left late Friday evening, and by the time we hit the off-road trails, it was nearly 2 a.m. A blizzard struck as soon as we started the climb, dumping snow so thick and fast that we had to crawl along at 10 miles per hour. The world around us turned into a swirling white abyss, and the off-road track became a treacherous gauntlet. By the time we reached the campsite, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow, illuminated by the full moon. It was breathtaking. We set up our tents quickly, eager to soak in the surreal beauty. Around 3 a.m., we grabbed a couple of beers and walked to the edge of the bluff to admire the lake, now partially frozen, glistening under the moonlight. The eerie silence of the snow-muted forest enveloped us, broken only by our occasional murmurs. "I've never seen it like this," Dan said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Me neither," I replied. "It's almost too quiet, isn't it?" We stood there for a while, soaking in the moment. The cliffs across the lake were sharp and imposing, and I couldn't resist testing the echo. Cupping my hands around my mouth, I let out a deep, guttural war cry, a mix of a howl and a whoop. The sound bounced off the cliffs, carrying far into the wilderness. Dan laughed and joined in, his voice louder and sharper than mine. But as his cry tapered off, something answered. It wasn't an echo. From the darkness behind us, across the camp, and just beyond the rugged cliff edge, came a scream, a piercing, guttural wail that froze the blood in my veins. It was human-like, but not entirely. It had the depth of a growl, the anguish of a cry, and the feral edge of something wrong. "What the hell was that?" Dan hissed, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, we heard it, a loud, resonant splash directly below us. Something massive had hit the water. The sound was so forceful, it sent ripples of vibration through the cold air. "Did you see that?" I whispered, staring at the lake. "No," Dan muttered, "but I heard it." The surface of the water churned violently. Whatever had jumped in was now swimming, thrashing straight toward us. The splashing was deliberate, powerful, and impossibly loud. Each kick sent an explosive crash echoing off the cliffs. It sounded like a human, but the sheer force was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Splash, 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 splash. "It's coming this way," Dan said, backing up. We watched in stunned silence as the sound grew closer, the water breaking in wild, frenzied bursts. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the splashing stopped. The shoreline beneath us was hidden by the cliff's shadow, but we heard it. Dripping water, the clinking of river rocks, and then the unmistakable crunch of something massive emerging from the lake. "Dan, get back to camp," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What about you?" he asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol on his belt. "I'll grab my gun. Just go." The footsteps were slow but deliberate, each one cracking branches and sending echoes through the still forest. Whatever it was climbing, scrambling up the rocky incline toward us with relentless determination. We bolted back to the campsite, the snow crunching loudly under our boots. I fumbled with my truck's lock and grabbed my revolver from the glove box, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. Dan stood beside me, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line beyond the tents. For a while, nothing happened. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that makes you feel small and exposed. We waited, listening, straining to hear anything over the sound of our own pounding hearts. Then, just as we started to relax, a single branch snapped. It was close, too close. "Stay here," Dan said, stepping forward with his pistol drawn. "No way," I hissed, gripping my revolver tightly. But whatever it was, it didn't show itself. After what felt like an eternity, we realized the forest had gone completely silent again. No wind, no animals, nothing. We stayed awake until dawn, sitting by the fire with our guns in our laps, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, we searched the area but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, not even a ripple in the lake. The only evidence of the night was the lingering dread that neither of us could shake. We didn't talk much for the rest of the trip, and when we finally packed up to leave, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes. Whatever was out there that night, man, beast, or something in between, I never want to encounter it again. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.